is really to look at unsheltered homelessness and the continuum of care. But with our experience, we know that you can't just look at homelessness, like unsheltered homelessness in a vacuum, and you must look at the entire system. But before we get into like some of our recommendations and some of our findings, we want to ensure that you know what we mean when we say an effective and efficient and equitable system. It is a system that starts with the end goal in mind, which is diverting people when safe and appropriate from entering into homelessness, which decreases their trauma exposure and has been proven to ensure that resources are efficiently and effectively spent. And also, when people are housed, we are working to house them. I mean, when people are homeless, we are working to house them as quickly as possible. So communities who have done this have had a tremendous it's been a long time since I've been in person, so a little bit different than a Zoom meeting. But communities who have done this effectively have really focused on utilizing Housing First throughout the entire system and really worked hard to house folks as quickly as possible. All the interventions in these communities and resources in these communities are coordinated towards a common goal, which is to make sure homelessness is rare, brief, and one time. That people who are in a housing crisis have immediate access to some type of resource, including a safe place to go. People are not unsheltered. People do not spend long time periods in homelessness. People exit quickly and do not quickly cycle right back into homelessness. So also with implementing these goals, we have to have some system measurement to figure out how we are doing this. And also with establishing these system performance goals, it's also important to understand that these goals are also tied to funding that can increase to ensure that we have more funding to address homelessness. But these measurements are reducing the amount of folks entering into homelessness. It's increasing folks exiting out of homelessness into permanent housing, and decreasing the average length of time someone experiences homelessness in the community, and decreases the returns of folks who experience homelessness from entering right back into the homeless system. So other communities who've excelled at meeting these goals have had equity as its foundation. And that's racial equity, that's equity when it comes to LGBTQIA+. They've also had Housing First instilled in all interventions, and I'll talk about what Housing First is shortly. They have, and part of that equity in the foundation, folks at the table, there's folks with lived experience, right? Because sometimes the folks who have the greatest understanding of what's happening in the system are the people who've experienced homelessness. So we have to elevate their voices and ensure that they're centered into the decision-making process. There's diversion when safe and appropriate, instilled at all access points of the system, right? Access points is how folks enter the system. So diversion, which I'll talk about in a couple slides, is really having housing-focused problem solving to see if there's any other place you can go outside of experiencing homelessness. Other practices are rapidly identifying folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness and quickly engaging them to connect them to crisis services and housing assistance. You have to have quick, accessible, low barriers to pathways to shelter and other crisis services with the goal of ensuring that the time in the shelter is short. So we have to have housing interventions in place to help folks exit out of the sheltered homelessness into some type of housing stability. And also that comes with rapidly connecting folks to a permanent housing intervention. So when I talk about like the system, think about it as a roundabout, right? You want to ensure that there is something, so you want to ensure that there's something at the very top of the intervention that decreases the inflow into the actual system flow, into the actual system, right? When folks enter into the system, there has to be interventions that help them exit out to the appropriate intervention. If one of the interventions in the system is not moving the way it's supposed to be moving, we get a stuck system. Or if you don't have the necessary interventions in the system, there's not going to be flow, right? So we have to ensure we have resources or interventions at the top to help folks from becoming homelessness And if they do become homelessness, we have interventions to help them quickly get out of it. What happens is, if the system we don't have system flow, we see an increase or unchanging number of folks experiencing unsheltered homelessness. We see long wait lists for shelters, for housing interventions. We see a significant amount of people in the system not getting any housing interventions at all. So those are all signs that a system does not have the proper flow. So here are some of the interventions that make up our, so when I use that roundabout, I'll say like the cars are the interventions, right? So these are some of the cars that help the system flow. A system should have homeless prevention, diversion, coordinated entry system, including an access point, coordinated street outreach, emergency, and I put effective shelter, and I'll talk about that here shortly, rapid rehousing, transitional housing, and supportive housing. With all of these having housing first infused into them, they all should be not only capturing data, sharing data, but using data to improve decisions. And also, again, having equity as the foundational piece to how interventions are provided. I'm not going to read all of these words on the screen, but you all have access to the PowerPoint to read some of these. I'm just going to highlight. So like some of these terms that we're using, homeless prevention is really something that's targeted for folks who are at risk of experiencing homelessness. And there is, when done well, there is some type of process or assessment that ensures that folks who are most at risk of becoming homeless, if they lose their housing, can stay in housing, right? The difference between homeless prevention and eviction prevention is this is really focused on folks becoming homeless, right? And the issue sometimes with homeless prevention is that there's not 100%, there's not a 100% key factor that would say somebody, if they lose their housing, they become homeless. But that's why we have assessment tools that has some sort of, to ensure that we're targeting our resources to the folks most in need. Diversion, on the other hand, is an intervention that uses some similar tactics to homeless prevention as far as having a housing-focused problem-solving conversation, but it happens at the immediate front door of the system when somebody's actively looking for shelter, actively experiencing homelessness, we're having those housing-focused conversations. That's where diversion comes into place. And then street outreach is crucial, but it has to be coordinated, it has to be housing-focused, it has to have, have emergency health and mental health services, provide consistent engagement to help link folks to crisis services and also housing interventions in the community. But I think the trick to street outreach is ensure that if we have multiple street outreach in the community, that they're all working together towards that, again, that overall system common goal. And then, so you see emergency shelter here, right? It's a short-term bed without a prescribed length of stay, provide safety, security, and housing navigation, case management. So that's like the bare minimum of what an emergency shelter is. What we're recommending to the community that will make the most impact is what we call an effective emergency shelter, right? That is a shelter that is housing focused, right? We're providing that emergency interventions of a shelter, but we're also trying to rapidly get folks into housing. Where it implements safe and appropriate diversion. It offers immediate and low barrier access. That just means people can access it, right? When we think about effective shelter, you think about it like an emergency room. If we have an emergency room that nobody can access, then what is the emergency room? So the effective emergency shelter is the emergency room. You also have to utilize data. There has to and share the data. Has to utilize culturally responsive and inclusive techniques and follow HUD's equal access rule. Rapid rehousing is one of the key interventions to help that system flow. If you don't have enough rapid rehousing, which is a short to medium term rental assistance, it is flexible, it's person-centered, up to 24 months, that serves to house people quickly and wrap them around with all the support services needed in order for them to stabilize within their housing crisis, to stabilize their housing. I'm gonna skip a couple of these, but I want to just highlight what housing first is. So housing first is an evidence-based practice that was created because in the early 90s in New York, they had folks who are going in and out of the emergency room, in and out of jail. They They were certainly in and out of emergency services, and everybody was like, well, what do we do? There's people who are who have high mental health diagnosis, who just are the folks that everybody in the community knows. And this organization did this radical thing and provided them with housing. Then when they provided them with housing, they wrapped the services around the housing, and they found out that people stayed in the housing. Instead of them having to prove, based off of a case manager's assessment or some type of regulatory rules from a program, that they were ready to go into housing. So that revolutionized the way we address homelessness, right? So it's really about understanding that Haslow's hierarchy of need. If somebody's on that safety rung, right? This is that psychology 101, that safety rung of like, where am I going to sleep tonight? What am I going to eat? Am I going to be safe? Where I'm sitting, where I'm sleeping? You can't address some of those big picture lifetime changes, such as maybe really analyzing a budget, or really adequately attending to substance use disorders, or a mental health diagnosis, right? The research actually found that once folks are housed, they have that very basic baseline met, that they can start addressing that. And then that's what the data has shown. So it's based on the understanding that it's client's choice, right? It's about not putting up barriers to housing for folks experiencing homelessness, but creating actually pathways to create that sustainability or stability, I should say. So here are some of the interventions that we found in the COC. Now, these are not representative of all folks who do everything that might fall under some of these categories. There might be some advocacy groups, some other nonprofits, but these are primarily folks who were identified under the housing inventory count, and also who are funded to do some level of housing focus, these housing focused interventions. So just some really quick key takeaways from this section. As Ann mentioned, there's some really great things. As we started this meeting, there's some really wonderful things underway. And what we're really trying to encourage is more coordination to really maximize a lot of these efforts. It's going to be impossible to end unsheltered homelessness. I mean, it's going to be really difficult to end unsheltered homelessness if the community does not have a functioning system, again, like that's clear leadership, that goes with the proper interventions that's needed to make sure their system flow, and and folks aren't doing housing focused interventions throughout the system. And that includes, again, housing first, equity, performance measurement, and being data driven, increasing that flow, ensuring there is flow, and coordination and collaboration amongst all parts of the system. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Ann to talk a little bit more about kind of the system governance piece.
So you've heard quite a bit now about what a system is. What are the components of a system? What are the things you need to have for a system to function well, right? You need to have coordinated street outreach. You need to make sure that folks are being engaged when they're living in unsheltered locations. You need to have effective emergency shelter so that outreach workers have somewhere to have somebody stay the night in a safe place. You need rapid rehousing, which is that short-term, up to 24-month rental assistance that help people get stabilized. You need supportive housing in order for folks who need that type of assistance long-term to be stable in their lives. So those are all the components of an effective system. You just heard Josh walk through all of those. And really, again, grounding all of that in a housing first approach, which means that you're really low barrier and you are recognizing that housing is the key component to safety so that folks can address some of their other life goals and challenges. You need to be grounded in equity. So all of those things are incredibly important. But I think the question for you all who are sitting at the table today, I would imagine, is how do you get that? How do you make the decisions that get you to an effective system? So we're going to spend the next chunk of time together talking a little bit about structure and governance. And the reason that we want to focus here for a little while is because the communities that we've seen across the country, and I'm going to give you some examples, that have the most effective systems in place, have strong leadership and strong structures that help them make decisions within the community, and that there is shared accountability across a number of different partners. So I'm going to start here and just give you the 35,000 foot view of, we've tossed around the term continuum of care a couple of times. So now we're going to drill into this and talk about what that means. In 1987, the federal government decided to start funding programs to serve people experiencing homelessness. The overall structure that Congress created is done through the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. And that actually establishes the way that the government responds to homelessness, the way that the federal government responds to homelessness. And I say that because it's important to know that there are two funding streams coming into your community that are a result of the McKinney-Vento Act. The first is the Continuum of Care program, and that's the one that we're going to spend the most time on. But for those folks in the city and the county, you're also familiar with the Emergency Solutions Grants Program, or ESG. You receive funding through that program on an annual basis. It's a formula program. But you also received a pretty good chunk of money through COVID response from the federal government. That program, just to give you a sense of scale, usually runs at about between $290 and $300 million annually. And I believe that the COVID response ESG money was about $4 billion. So you can see that there was a pretty big uptick in the investment through that program during the pandemic. And I say all of that, again, those are the two funding streams, but the Continuum of Care is the core of that program. And that program is designed to do these things. And these are all things that we're going to be talking about today. It is designed to promote community-wide planning and the strategic use of resources within a community to end and address homelessness. And when I say strategic use of resources, I don't mean HUD money. I mean a strategic use of all of the resources within a community that are available to serve people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. It is also designed to improve coordination and integration with what we call mainstream resources. And in your context, most of the mainstream resources sit within the county, and those are things like behavioral health, mental health, substance use services. Within your community, that also includes hospitals and other healthcare services, and sometimes education services. So the Continuum of Care is meant to promote coordination between a number of bodies and create a way to plan together and to have that shared accountability so that everybody is sort of rowing in the same direction. It's also designed to improve data collection and performance measurement. We started this conversation today by talking a little bit about an effective system means that you know that it's effective because you're measuring your performance. You're measuring how you're doing against a set of goals, and we're going to talk a little bit about data as we move forward in today's presentation. And then the most important thing here, I think, is that it's flexible enough that it allows each community to tailor its response to its particular environment, strengths and challenges. And we're going to keep coming back to that because there is no one size fits all approach. You can't just take what's happening in Houston and plop it into Asheville, Buncombe County and think it's going to work here. There are aspects to that you can use and you can learn from other communities and what's working and what's not. But really, the Continuum of Care program is designed to allow communities to tailor their response to what the specific needs are in their community. That program runs this, right now it's running at about $2.8 billion nationwide. So a little bit shy of $3 billion nationwide. So you can see that that's where we are focusing, and those are the requirements that really are the backbone of the federal response to homelessness. And then to qualify for funding under the Continuum of Care program and the ESG program, every community has to establish and operate a continuum of care. So we're using that terminology both to describe the name of the program, but also to describe the continuum of care in your area. Your continuum of care is the city of Asheville and the county. Many continuums are structured that way. San Diego is structured that way. King County is structured that way, where it's sort of the main city within an area and then the county itself. And the last award that you all received from HUD through that program was just shy of $1.9 million, and that's an annual award that you all received. So I want to pause there and see if there are any questions from the table about the COC program and sort of the structure of that program.
No, I would just add that currently that would be HIAC, that is our COC.
That's right. HIAC acts as your Continuum of Care board, and the city of Asheville acts as the applicant for HUD money. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next couple of slides. Any other questions from the table? Okay. So a continuum of care, what HUD requires for folks to create in order to access this particular set of funding is a community planning body that coordinates all of these activities, both homelessness activities and homelessness prevention activities, in a self-determined geographic area. I just mentioned that your geographic boundary is the county, but it includes the city. In other communities, it can be a state, it can be a number of counties that band together as a region, or it can be a standalone city. I grew up in the first continuum of care in the country, which is the District of Columbia, and that is only the city of Washington, D.C., rather than a region. And the COC has three main responsibilities. It has to operate itself. It has to designate and operate what I would call the backbone of your homelessness assistance system in terms of data, and that's a homeless management information system. Every community, there's between 350 and 400 continuums of care nationwide, and every single one of them has a homeless management information system, or HMIS, that collects information about people who are receiving services, about the programs that provide those services, and about what the needs are of the people who are coming into the system for assistance, and uses that information in order to evaluate how your programs are doing, and enumerate the number of people that are experiencing homelessness, not just at a point in time, but over the course of a year. So homeless management information systems and the data that they produce are incredibly important to understanding how your system is functioning, whether that flow that Josh talked about is working well or not working, and where you're stuck. If you are stuck anywhere, where those sticking points are. And it can do that both at the project level, so an individual organization can look at their own data and understand how they're performing, but the system can also look at the data and understand how the system is performing. And let me give you an example of what that might look like and why it's important to have both of those levels. It is often a program will report their outcomes. Let's just say program A reports their outcomes and is looking at their data, and they're seeing that they exit, it's a rapid rehousing program, they exit 95% of the people in that program to permanent housing, and those folks stay to permanent housing. And they think they're doing a great job. And in fact, it sounds like they are doing a great job and probably are doing a great job. When you look at that data from the system level, you can actually see what happened to those folks who exited to permanent housing and measure how many of them come back into the system over time. And let's just take this example one step further. So let's say that the system folks are looking at the data and they see of that 95%, a large number are returning to homelessness. That means that there's a problem that that project couldn't see themselves, that can be seen at the system level, and then you have the opportunity to actually go and intervene and fix whatever that problem is. That's why data is important. That's why HUD requires a homeless management information system. And then of course the third major responsibility is doing planning. All of that planning about the homelessness response system that Josh talked you through, that gets done within the continuum of care. So all of those three broad categories include a number of very specific responsibilities that are enshrined in the law or in the statute for the continuum of care program and carry through the rest of HUD's funding. And I know this is tiny, and I, again, took off my glasses, so we'll work from the screen up here. The continuum of care has to establish a board. HIAC acts as that board right now. It actually has to identify who's going to submit the application for HUD funding. The city of Asheville acts in that capacity right now. They are called the collaborative applicant, and they submit the funding package to HUD every year. They have to develop a governance charter which shows who is responsible for what and really identifies those roles and responsibilities within the continuum of care, so everybody is clear about what they're doing and what their partners are doing. They, again, have to establish and operate the systems that act as the backbone for any good, effective homelessness assistance system. We've already talked a bit about HMIS and why that's incredibly important, but the other piece of that backbone is really your coordinated entry system. Josh talked a little bit about that, and that is your access points. How do people enter into the homelessness assistance system? How do they get assessed? And how are they triaged for the right kind of intervention based on their needs? That's a coordinated entry system. They have to create and enforce written standards, again, so everybody in the community knows what they're supposed to be doing and what they're working towards and who has what piece of the puzzle. Establish performance targets. We talked about why that's important. So the COC has to establish performance targets, and they're going to use that information when they submit funding requests to HUD every year. They have to consult and coordinate on the emergency solutions grants funding that I talked about earlier, and develop a plan for the community. It's a heavy lift. It's why structure and governance is so important. So next I'm going to give you some examples of how other communities structure their continuums of care. Houston, Texas is widely regarded as one of the most effective COCs in the country, and it is very much tied to how they are structured and how they make their decisions. you know, Houston was probably one of the first communities in the country to end veteran homelessness. They've made a lot of progress on chronic homelessness, and they have been working a lot on unsheltered homelessness recently. So this structure has been really important for them to have in place, and it has a number of organizations and entities that are involved. They are a city-county, so when I say Houston, Texas, what I actually mean is the city of Houston and Harris County. So they are the same as you all, where they have a county organization, they have county government involved, and they have city government.
Where is their COC housed?
Their COC is housed within a nonprofit organization that acts as both the collaborative applicant and basically staffs the continuum of care. So that's the Houston Coalition to End Homelessness.
So not under the city or the county, but in collaboration with.
That's right. So, and the city and county have seats on the continuum of care board. So you can see the way that they're structured here. They have a steering committee, which is their primary decision-making body. The nonprofit has a representation there. Their local university that helps them with their data analysis and crunching has a seat on that steering committee. Some of their key stakeholders or key providers in the community have seats. A person or people with lived experience of homelessness that can really say what's happening within the system have seats. And that steering committee, that primary decision-making body, has a number of planning and implementation bodies that report to them. And these are not bodies in word only. They are actively working these issues that they are responsible for. So you can see here on the left, there are a number of standing committees that are really in place all the time to monitor the systems that they need to have operational in order for their continuum of care to work. So that's making sure that they're getting provider input, making sure that their data is solid, making sure that they're getting input from people with lived experience of homelessness, their coordinated entry system, and their domestic violence coordinated access system, which sits alongside their coordinated entry system. I will say that after Hurricane Harvey, I had the chance to go down there and sit with this continuum of care to rapidly rehouse. You know, at its largest, they had a shelter with 10,000 people in it. And by the time I got there a few days after the hurricane, there were probably 6,000, 5,000 people. We used this structure in order to rapidly rehouse folks who had lost their housing after Hurricane Harvey. So it can be expanded and contracted based on need.
Could you clarify the staffing structure that supports this, and if that staff are all staff members of the nonprofit that you named as anchors?
Yes, so the staff members that support the continuum of care sit at the Houston Coalition to End Homelessness. Operating the continuum of care is not the only thing that the coalition does, but it is a core component of their work. So they submit the application to HUD, and they staff and make sure that all of the notes are taken and the kinds of things that need to happen for cross-sector communication throughout this structure happen. So they're not the decision makers, though. They are just making sure that the decision makers have the information that they need in order to make good decisions.
Thank you.
It's a great question, thank you. And then you can see that they have decided that the way that they want to be structured is that they have implementation bodies and planning bodies with specific types of oversight where they need it, and work groups that support those bodies on populations. So they have one on chronic homelessness, they have one on veteran homelessness, families, and youth. And I forgot to tell you what I meant by youth when I teed it up earlier. When we talk about youth and young adults, we're talking about young people aged 18 to 24 who are experiencing homelessness. And you can also see that chronic homelessness, that's led by the mayor's leadership team. That's the oversight that has been created, but the work groups, which are the providers in the community, are feeding that sort of, that structure, that mayor's leadership team.
And just for clarification, they have a strong mayor system.
Yes, that's right, they have a strong mayor system. Another city-county structure that I just wanted to quickly show you all, San Diego City and County is one continuum of care. They are a little bit bigger than you all. They have a number of additional cities within the county that are not the city of San Diego, so it's a little bit more complicated in terms of politics. But you can see here that they have, again, an advisory board at the top. They have an executive committee that really is the day-to-day operation. The organization that runs this continuum of care is the Regional Task Force on Homelessness, and that is a nonprofit organization. They have standing committees based on what their priorities are. So you can see governance, making sure that their governance is always solid and that they are making tweaks to it as they need to. They've decided to have a standing committee around evaluation. That means that they look at their data every single day. And if you go to their website, they actually post live data every day for the community to look at. That all runs through the continuum of care. And then over there on the right-hand side is the Veterans Work Group. That's in part because right now they have a goal to end veteran homelessness. That is one of their primary goals as a continuum. So they have a standing committee that supports that work. And then they have a number of ad hoc committees that are created based on what the changing needs in their environment are. So you can see that they have an ad hoc committee right now that's very active on addressing homelessness among Black San Diegans. They have one on aging. We know that the population of people experiencing homelessness across the country is getting older, so this is an emerging issue. So all of these are sort of emerging issues that they want to make sure that they're paying close attention to, and they have the ability through their governance structure to create these ad hoc committees to address them, then dissolve them. Their standing committees are the ones in blue.
For communities our size, about 270,000, have you found the best path forward to be to look at these larger models and kind of figure out a local version of that works structurally and in terms of capacity? Or
I think it's really helpful to look at how other models are set up, and this one is probably the one that's closest to you all in terms of scale and in terms of setup. But it's also quite structured. I'm sorry.
Before you go to Spokane, on the San Diego, again, where's the COC housed? Is it a nonprofit entity?
Yes,
Also?
the Regional Task Force is a nonprofit entity. They actually started as a quasi-government, and they were a joint powers authority when they were first established, but they decided to become a regular nonprofit organization over time. And then for this one, Josh knows this one a little bit better than I do. I haven't been to Spokane recently, so I might have to send questions over his way. But what you can see here is, this is the Spokane City and County Continuum of Care. They have their Continuum of Care stakeholders at the top and have a board. The COC collaborative applicant is the City of Spokane. So that's, again, sort of closest to the way that you all currently operate. And they have a number of committees that are standing committees: their executive committee, their data and evaluation committee, their planning and implementation committee, and something else that I can't read either here or there, which means I need new glasses. And then, that's right, that's their, how they get their funding out the door. Thank you very much for that assist. And then you can see that they actually show on this, unlike the other two, that they actually show on the side of the Continuum of Care board how that board is expected to coordinate with both the city and the county. So they're very deliberate about how that coordination and collaboration happens and why it happens. Josh, did I miss anything on that?
And that one is housed within the
the city of Spokane.
I would just highlight that it's still under the COC governance structure, right? So I mean, I think the collaborative app, as you see under the COC board, the city is still that, it still serves as that function, but it's still governed in like, it works on behalf of the overall community of care board, which is staffed partly by the community of care stakeholders. So.
And all these committees are not, I think that's a really important point to make. In all three of these examples, the committees are not the organization that staffs it. The committees are made up of your community stakeholders. So they're your local university folks, they are your service providers within your community, they are faith-based organizations, local businesses, folks who have an interest and some expertise to bring to the table for those subcommittees are the folks who make up the subcommittees. And they can be staffed by an organization that helps manage the continuum of care. But again, that organization is the regional task force, for example, in San Diego, is not sitting on all of those committees.
And I've got a question for you before you go to
Yes.
our own. Understanding that one of those slides is to show us examples of a top-down structure. Are those communities also examples you would highlight as places that are spending adequate local dollars on the problem in proportion to the quantity of homeless persons they have, and building adequate quantities of shelter beds and homes in
Yeah, I get tripped up a little bit by the word adequate, because I don't think in any of these communities they have the amount of resources that they actually need in order to end homelessness. What I would say is the investment by the state, city, or county differs among all three of these. And the one that probably is the most robust, I think, is San Diego. Their housing authority actually leads a lot of their work locally and provides a lot of housing resources into the system. That said, you know, both the county and the city have, over the last 3 to 4 years, really ramped up their investment on the shelter side, on diversion, as well as on through, you know, the Housing Commission to provide additional permanent, affordable housing resources. So of all three of these, I think probably San Diego is most robust. Houston also has quite a bit of money coming through the city of Houston, and then the mainstream resources, like in your community, come through the county. So behavioral health systems in particular.
I'm curious, how much of the funds from these setups come from outside the city and county, from private sources or foundations or whatever?
So I would, without having, you know, I don't know that I anticipated this exact question, but what I can say is, one, we can go back and find that out for you. I think that we have data on all of that. But there's two things that are really important in those setups. One is political will. The political will to push the community towards these kinds of solutions and making tough decisions and trying to keep the politics, frankly, out of an evidence-based approach. And that works across all three of these communities that I have experienced myself. In terms of funding, California has a lot of state funding. So I would, if I had to guess around San Diego without looking at their data, having it right in front of me, I would guess that the bulk of the money comes from the state of California, and the city and the county are next highest, and then the continuum of care dollars. Whereas that is not necessarily the case in Spokane. I think in Spokane, probably the bulk of the money is federal money, and then maybe city and state, and then county, city and county, and then state. But we can get that information for you if you'd like. Again, I think it's really about understanding your own strengths, what the community brings to the table, and maximizing the impact that you can have both from a leadership perspective and from a funding perspective. So here's your continuum of care as it stands right now. What I will note, and Josh will hopefully correct me if I'm wrong here, is that there's some new energy around HIAC, and really the restructuring process has already started. Folks are already thinking about how to make your continuum of care more robust and more able really to make well-informed decisions across a number of stakeholders in your community, and to create that strong structure that we've been talking about. So right now, your collaborative applicant, as I've mentioned a couple of times, is the city of Asheville, and you have 16 seats, 8 of which are appointed by the city council, 8 of which are appointed by the county commissioners, and then you have some work groups that have been put together to do specific kinds of projects. And I've heard from Josh and from members of your staff in the community that probably the best functioning work group that you have, and the work that's really, again, going back to sort of shared accountability, shared understanding and decision making, is really around Code Purple. And then you have a number of key partners here in your community. I won't read off all of these words. Again, they're discussed at some length in the report itself, and for those of you who have access to the PowerPoint deck, you can read it. But you have HIAC, who we've already talked about, starting to go through a process of restructuring, rethinking to how to use their authority and responsibilities. You have, of course, the city of Asheville, who has 4 full-time, am I right with 4? 4 full-time staff people working on this issue in their own division and acting as the collaborative applicant for your continuum of care. You have the county, who again brings to the table these mainstream resources, but doesn't really have enough dedicated staff. I think it's less than 1 full-time equivalent dedicated staff, and that's one of the recommendations that we're making in this report, is to increase the dedicated staff to adding 1 full-time equivalent at this point. You have your housing authority. My understanding is that the head of your housing authority sits on HIAC, and hi, is that you? And can tie those things together in really robustly structured continuums of care. Housing authorities have a really important role to play and a seat at the table. And then you have the Homeless Coalition. You have a number of homelessness and housing service providers and community stakeholders. And then I'm gonna just end this slide with the VA. You're gonna see a little bit later that you have a lot of resources for veterans experiencing homelessness in your community. The VA isn't tied strongly enough to the continuum of care in your community, and has a lot of resources that aren't really right now sort of fully coordinated in ways that make a lot of operational sense. So before we take a break, I know I'm running a little bit over, but I just want to one more time note some key takeaways here. Again, we want to make sure you lack an entity that really can do that heavy lift of coordination and collaboration. Your continuum of care has to include, but shouldn't be limited to, your local governments. You have a lot of other stakeholders that care about this in your community and that have expertise to bring to the table. This will also take time. I want to note that because I think it's really important. We're gonna have to figure out in your community exactly what the right structure is that makes sense here with your local environment, and that's gonna take a little bit of time. We wanna act with urgency, but we wanna make sure that we're grounded in the values that this community has brought forward. So I think we are scheduled for a break. Want to do 10 minutes, and then we'll be back, and we'll start talking about the state of housing and homelessness.
I'm not sure if this is working.
Alright,
So we'll reconvene at 2:25.